The host. You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. Hello, and welcome to the 50th episode of Economics Detective Radio. We're going to do things a little bit differently this time, so I'll turn it over to the host today, which will not be me. Today, the host will be previous guest, Ash Navabi. Ash, welcome.
Hi, thanks for asking me to do this. Great honor.
Yeah, I mean, most podcasts tend to fizzle out around the 7-episode mark. They say, you know, your podcast is getting serious when you hit double digits, but now here we are at 50 episodes, which, if I had released every week, would have taken about a year, but I didn't release every week, especially not early on, and so I guess it's been a couple years.
Well, you're still young. You still got lots of time in your career. You'll get to 300 episodes in no time.
Yes, eventually.
Maybe one day. Yeah, eventually. Anything will happen.
So, let's see. What shall we talk about? I'm not used to doing this from the other side, but I'll leave it to you to direct.
Right. So let me ask you the most obvious question. What have you learned over the last 50 episodes?
Okay, so I'd say that probably the most sort of specific and useful things I've learned were in the 4 or 5 episodes I did about urban economics. So I did fairly early on, I interviewed Pierre de Rocher about the life and work of Jane Jacobs, and that sort of got me interested in this sort of field of urban economics and the idea of a sort of richer idea of the way cities come together and the way people, you know, live together and the way they form communities and the way the interaction between sort of economics and the sort of social world, what we would have thought as not economics, at least back in the 40s. And I got interested in that, and so I did what I sometimes do to find guests. I went on a urban economics type Facebook group, Market Urbanism, and just posted and said, hey, can you guys recommend some good guests about this topic? And I got 4 great suggestions, which were Nolan Gray, Emily Hamilton, Stephen Smith, and Chuck Marohn, and all 4 of them agreed to be on the show, which I wasn't actually expecting. And I got 4 different takes on urban economics and on different sides of the whole urban economic issue or the issues. So Emily Hamilton approached it from a very sort of policy research standpoint, citing recent studies and talking about land use restrictions and the way they push up prices. Chuck Marohn is sort of more, he was a former civil engineer, and he comes at it from a more sort of Jane Jacobs sort of holistic standpoint. He talks about things like the need to make streets narrower so that people drive slower, and not try to make what he calls stroads, which are a combination of streets and roads that are trying to be, a place for people to live and people to shop and do all these things, but also trying to be major thoroughfares, major ways to get 1,000 people from point A to point B. And of course, they do both of them really badly. And so that's sort of an example of really poor city planning that makes a lot of cities not nice places to live, especially if you can't afford the super high rents in the urban centers. And I think that all sort of drew a picture for me. I haven't done a lot of episodes on this, but I've always sort of been a believer in open borders and that labor mobility is very important for the economy and for people's well-being. And there's this interesting dynamic within countries as well, setting aside the border, that when you make it very hard and very expensive to live in the cities, that's where all the job opportunities are, and it makes it very hard for people to move to those opportunities, and it reduces the labor mobility within your country. And so there's this interesting dynamic where we've got these sort of local level urban planning they call them NIMBYs, not in my backyard. You have this dynamic where they don't let the NIMBYs, the locals, don't want apartment buildings in their neighborhood, so they block development. So millennials and poor people can't move to the cities, which is where the jobs are, and you end up with just a very rough situation for those people and for the economy as a whole.
Follow up on your immigration point. You interviewed Dr. Garrett Jones from George Mason University, and he mentioned perhaps, or maybe suggested perhaps, an IQ-based immigration policy.
Yes.
I'm wondering if that interview changed your views on open borders at all.
The thing about Garrett Jones as an open borders critic is you have to realize that his proposal would allow for free migration from high IQ countries like China and India, which is already, like I think a quarter of the Earth's population, or a very large fraction of the Earth's population. And not only that, but a very large fraction of the Earth's poor population. So I think even if we conceded Garrett Jones' whole point and agreed that he has his O-ring theory of development and of economic growth, where there are some industries where you just need a critical mass of high-skilled people, and where a lesser skilled person would have a strongly negative marginal product. So, whoever didn't check the O-ring on the space shuttle Challenger clearly they didn't just have a marginal product of $10 an hour. They had a marginal product of negative $1 million for however many hours. And even if we're totally convinced by Garrett Jones' point on that, it still calls for a much more open migration regime. Like right now, it's hard even for Canadians to migrate to the United States. And I don't know of any sort of coherent theory or even like regular people's ideology if they are afraid about migration. Usually it's not about like Canadians, and yet somehow the rules and the sort of self-justifying, self-reinforcing nature of setting up a migration bureaucracy seems to just restrict everything to an absurd degree. It makes no sense to me that Canada and the United States would not have open borders, and even if we didn't go all the way to letting, say, two countries that are at war with each other, letting their whole populations just move freely, at least start with countries like the US and Canada that are so similar, open those borders, and I'm sure there will be no big disaster from doing that, and we can, go from there. If that works out, open up to the next country and the next one, and I predict that if that happened, we'd see pretty much good results.
Just as an interesting aside about Canada-U.S. immigrant relations, Canada actually has a points-based system for immigrants, and if you scrutinize it correctly, you'll notice that if you are a PhD professor of economics, you don't qualify as having had the right experience. Professor of economics at Texas Tech University, Ben Powell, he had a Facebook post last year where he was mentioning immigration restrictions, and he said that he, as a PhD holder working in a university for 10 years, would not qualify to move to Canada based on points.
Yeah. See, I feel like all these in like, when you're on Facebook and you're talking with so your Facebook friend's aunt who is not a policy wonk at all, we sort of tend to discuss things in these purely qualitative terms, or like we tend to discuss things in terms of the extremes. Like you'll end up debating like pure 100% open borders, no restrictions versus pure 100% no one can cross the border at all. And then when people sort of, destroy this straw man of, well, it's not always a straw man, but when they're arguing against open borders and in favor of the current system, it tends to always seem like they think the current system is like, if if you have terrorist connections, you can't come in, which, of course you can't, and probably wouldn't be allowed to, even if more, even if the econ departments of the world came together and designed their ideal migration policy, it wouldn't, they wouldn't take the labor mobility argument so far as to allow, known criminals or people who clearly have ill intentions to cross any border they want. But the system we have now is much closer to a system of total prohibition of all movement across borders. Not movement to go on vacation, but movement to try get a job, to try to work in a different country. And, it doesn't make a lot of sense. There's the argument for free trade in goods and in capital is exactly the same as the argument for free trade in labor. And you do get that productivity boost from just having a free labor market. And you get a lot of great ethnic restaurants, which, that's the part that benefits me personally. Here in Vancouver, there's, great, Ethiopian restaurants and a great ramen scene downtown. And I think if we had closed our border and not let anyone through from any foreign country, we'd have a pretty boring choice of cuisine, which I know it's not the most important thing, but it's important to me.
And the incomparability of intersubjective or interpersonal utility comparisons, who's to say that your utility from getting ramen downtown isn't outweighed by everyone else's utility keeping away ramen from downtown?
Yeah. Well, I think of myself as a utility monster, so...
Of course. On the issue of immigration and free trade, what do you make of the economics of becoming a citizen via investment? So Canada's immigration, right, so Citizenship and Immigration Canada allows that if you can demonstrate that you have business experience, have a net worth of at least 1.6 million Canadian dollars, and are willing to invest 800,000 Canadian dollars, you're a citizen immediately. Or you can streamline the process as opposed to going through all the points, etc. So can you think of this with respect to urban economics? I think in some countries you can even use this investment for homes. Right.
So they're sort of incentivizing people to pump up real estate prices, saying if you...
Well, it could be real estate. Yeah, you could buy like 3 or 4 units in a condo building, call yourself a landlord, and then that's your business now.
Okay. Well, since I oppose the original restriction, I suppose any loophole is de facto a good thing, right? But it seems I would just put the bar way lower, make it accessible to people who just want to come here and do like a regular average job. If you want to move here and, pick apples, that's still a contribution. It does mean cheaper apples on the global market, and tends to benefit. It benefits most people. It doesn't benefit locals who directly compete with you for apple picking jobs, but that's such a small portion of the population. And, in practice, it wouldn't just be apple pickers. It would be, PhD physicists and... Yeah, PhD physicists, apple pickers, investment bankers, everything in between. And that's just, and then we can all benefit from buying each other, from trading with each other. What was it Adam Smith said? The division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So I expect,
exactly.
If we were to greatly increase our population via immigration, we could have markets that don't currently exist.
All right. So Garrett, on this issue of free trade and globalization, I've heard from a lot of senior professors that younger students and also some environmental activists will like to push back against global free trade by saying that the carbon footprint of these transactions is not worth it, it's too much, that the environmental costs to growth outweigh the benefits. I'm wondering if you have any sort of argument against this.
Oh man, so in the first bit we went full open borders to alienate everyone on the right, and now we're going to alienate everyone on the left. So that's fun. So yeah, a recent guest on the show was Kate Rayworth. I was sort of branching out because I usually bring people on who are more libertarian, but she's an Oxfam economic researcher and clearly on the political left. But I mean, I was pleasantly surprised by how much agreement we had on many things. She's definitely not. I was kind of worried that she would be part of this anti-economics left you see in some like student movements, and the sort of the group that doesn't really think economics has anything to offer. But she's definitely not that. She's definitely sees the power of economics well understood and well taught to make the world a better place. But she is on this sort of view that that we can grow too much. We can have too much economic growth, and we can push beyond the bounds of our ecosystem, and I guess create some kind of irreversibly and catastrophically destroy the planet in pursuit of growth. And one interesting thing she said is that we're all kind of assuming that growth is exponential, but what if it's more like a sort of logit function, something that sort of exponentially, or something that looks like it's an S curve. It looks like it's got accelerating growth, and then it has decelerating growth, and then it hits an asymptote. And if all we're doing by accelerating economic growth is getting to the asymptote 2 years quicker, maybe we should prioritize other things. And I can respect that as a self-consistent, a view that is not totally crazy, that could be right. I don't necessarily agree with it. And so where Kate Rayworth started to lose me was toward the end of the interview, when she said that we need to completely wean ourselves off fossil fuels. And I guess Pierre de Rocher has done really good work on this, and he's also a guest of the show. But basically, fossil fuels are just so useful for humanity, have produced so much. And while it's true that they also pollute, I really doubt, I think it's fairly utopian to think that we can wean ourselves off them completely without maybe being able to support a much lower population or a lower standard of living. So, I mean, there are just an enormous number of things that we do with fossil fuels, and a lot of them are things that would be very hard to do with alternative energies, alternative materials. Many of the materials in the recording equipment we're using to have this conversation are petroleum products, things made of plastic, and before we had rubber to put on the bottom of our shoes, you'd wrap your foot in leather, and then you'd slip and slide on mud, or you'd put metal tacks on the bottom of your shoe, like soccer cleats, and then you'd slip and slide on any hard flat surface. And so, just even little things like being able to walk on different surfaces without falling down are things we owe to petroleum products. And then, of course, there's the issue of having energy sources that we can use at any time, right? Solar and wind are great when it's sunny or windy, but in order to have a working power grid, you need to be producing the same level of energy that people are consuming, or close to the same. If you produce too much, you have brownouts. If you produce too little, you have blackouts. And we're just not good enough at storing energy right now to be able to, have giant batteries that can power a whole electrical grid when it's neither sunny nor windy. So yeah, but I mean, this is all sort of dancing around it's besides the point, the main issue is climate change. Do we need, what level of sacrifice is necessary to prevent climate change? And this is something that I regret not having really had a climate change episode in the first 50 episodes of the show. I know Bob Murphy has done really good work on it, and a lot of his work amounts to, he's not a he's an economist, right? And so it's policy focused, and he's not doing what I think a lot of people think the sort of skeptical side of the climate change debate does. He's not going to, alternative niche studies published by the fossil fuel industry about how climate change is all a hoax, right? No. What Bob Murphy does is he goes and he's basically just reading the IPCC reports, right? What are the models that they are using and what do they say? And he points out that these models that the official models from the IPCC, so what we call the consensus, they are saying that at the end of the century, if we don't stop climate change, then it'll result in an 8% lower GDP. And the thing about that is, that's one bad recession. People talk about it like it's the end of humanity, the end of life on Earth. Often they'll insinuate or imply, not usually in the serious policy debate, but in memes on, shared on Facebook, that humanity's doomed in a few decades. And that is, if anything, that's farther from the consensus forecast than even the deniers, right? If the deniers are saying there's no such thing as climate change, and you're saying that climate change will result in 100%, loss of GDP by the end of the century, and what the consensus forecast is that it'll cost 8% of GDP. Well, you're off by 92, and they're only off by 8. So there's an issue of magnitude. The real issue in the climate change policy debate isn't whether it's all a hoax or whether it's an immediate existential risk. That seems very unlikely. But just a point estimate. It comes down to, what cost do we put on an extra ton of carbon added to the atmosphere? And Bob Murphy has done a lot to show, that question is really complex, and there's a lot of economics to it. For instance, how much do we discount the future? What's the right way to discount the future? And, if we're trading off climate against economic growth, we talked about the potential for an S curve of economic growth, but assuming economic growth stays, with the exponential pattern we've seen since the Industrial Revolution, the difference between 2% growth and 3% growth is that you double an extra time in the next 70 years. So if the consensus estimate is that climate change could cost us 8% of GDP in, I guess, 80 years. And we know just from simple math that reducing the economic growth rate from 3 to 2% would cost us 50% of GDP in only 70 years, then that really puts a lot of it into context where, it's not implausible that, at least with the more radical proposals, that they could mean a whole percentage point difference in economic growth. But even if it was a half percentage point, it would still be such a huge cost that it would not be worth paying. And I mean, in terms of the idea of maybe it's an existential risk, and maybe Earth is unlivable not in 100 years but in 200, 300. I just have maybe more confidence in the geoengineering side of things. If we're talking about humans several hundred years from now, if we're worried about their problems, it's sort of like, can you imagine if your great-great-grandparents in 1850 were worrying about your problems? I mean, if you could talk to them, you'd say, hey, we're fine. Deal with your own stuff. Compared to us, you would be the poorest of the poor in our society. You don't have, medical innovations. You don't have electricity in your home. You don't have the automobile. And, if you're putting aside, if you're putting aside your own wealth and your own, fulfillment and health and all these things to help us, don't do that, because, we're fine. We're so much wealthier than the people 100 years ago were. And similarly, the people 100 years from now will be so much wealthier than us, presumably, if the pattern of the last 300, 400 years continues, that, yeah, I'm not sure it's totally valid to put their needs ahead of ours.
So you raised a few interesting points there. First of all, for listeners who might not be familiar, when you mentioned how just a 1% change in growth rates today from 2 to 3% is going to double our growth rate in 70. That's just a reference to the rule of 70 for any readers, for any listeners who might not be familiar. And this segues in a video blog you made on your YouTube channel where you talk about the Garden of the Forking Paths. Can you talk about that?
Right. Okay. So that's a phrase that, I mean, it comes from I believe a short story from the 1960s, but Andrew Gilman, the statistician, repurposed that phrase to talk about statistics, and it's this idea of a garden of forking paths. The idea is you make a lot of small choices when you do any kind of statistical work, empirical research, and if you can, and these are little things that we don't think about. So little things like, deciding the specification of a regression model. Not everyone maybe is familiar with that, but just deciding what model to fit to the data. Or deciding between different data sources, possibly deciding whether to exclude some sort of anomalous, something that looks like it's maybe an outlier. Decisions about what hypotheses to test when you're looking at your data. And the point Andrew Gelman's making is that often in the, when we publish our study and send it off to journals or it gets reported in the press or something, we don't correct for all those degrees of freedom. We don't correct for the fact that we maybe made 100 little choices. And even if we're not aware of it, even if we're not trying to consciously bias our our estimates or our results, if we make those 100 little choices in a way that is just subtly biasing things in one direction, maybe towards statistical significance, which it's an unfortunate reality that you publish a study with no little stars next to the numbers in the regression table. No, if you publish a study where the result is basically we can't show that the thing we're studying has any importance or any effect on the thing we hypothesize it has an effect on, then it's much harder to get published and harder to get tenure and probably get less attention from your peers and from the press. I think in the video I did apply it to climate change, just that, and I wasn't saying that climate scientists necessarily do this. I was just saying that from a science perspective, from the perspective of someone in science, even if it's social science, there's all science, statistics is the same in all fields. So it's something we can all talk about, across fields. But as someone who does science, you look at another field and you don't worry that the entire field is going to be a hoax. That's something that comes up in the public debates, and it's sort of people are very vitriolic when things become politicized. But as you look at it from the perspective of science, and if a lot of people in a field have a similar, face an incentive or have a similar, come from a similar viewpoint, you might worry that a lot of these little choices are being made in a way that might bias their estimates of some particular thing. And it's not just a climate science thing, it's an every science thing. And and I definitely worry about it in our own field, which is economics. So you gotta take every analysis with a grain of salt, and then you look at the meta-analysis and take that with a grain of salt too, because they're making choices too, and can still fall victim to all these problems associated with doing empirical work.
Speaking of research, one of the guests you had on your show is Professor Michael Munger of Duke University, and he likes to give a lot of advice to young academics and grad students, especially about writing. So given that you talked about some choices researchers make, I'm wondering what kind of choices that you are recently making as a young researcher, keeping in mind that research is a finicky process with a lot of dead ends. Just curious what you're working on right now.
Okay, so I'm probably not doing as much writing and research as I should be, but I am doing.
None of us are.
I know. We can never live up to that standard, but we try. And so right now I'm working on. So I'm co-authoring a paper in experimental economics with two of my professors and another grad student, and it's about sort of a meta level methodology paper, just about the way we deliver instructions in lab experiments. So pretty far removed from most of the things we've talked about on the show, although I did have one episode fairly early on about experimental economics and the history of that subfield. But it's, I'm doing that, and I think it's a good contribution. We did a meta-analysis of, 200 or so recent papers, experimental papers, and the way they delivered their instructions. And, I wouldn't say this area is my passion or that this is going to be my greatest work, but it's great to just sort of learn about some successful academics with tenure and the way their research process works, and just getting some experience doing that. I am also working on my own experimental project that relates to crime and courts. There's this thing called economic imperialism, which I think starts with Gary Becker, but in like the 60s. But it used to be that economists studied the economy, whatever that is, but basically markets and trade, and didn't go much beyond that. And then we just developed such powerful methods for studying markets and trade and the economy, things that people would think of as economic, that we just started branching out into every other social science. And, they called it economic imperialism because it was like a sort of hostile takeover of the rest of social science. And so you'll see economics papers about, the family or things that you typically associate with other fields. You see public choice, which is economists studying what political scientists typically study or, used to be the sole practitioners of. And I consider this paper I'm working on as the sort of experimental economists' imperialism into legal research. So I noticed that there are hundreds, probably thousands of studies that are mock trials, so they're trying to study, laws and courts and, the way that the jury trials play out in the courtroom with different kinds of evidence, different kinds of laws. And I noticed that all of these mock trials, obviously I haven't looked at the many thousands of them, but all the ones I looked at were based on hypothetical situations. So you get people in a room, or you ask people, hypothetically, if you were on the jury and this evidence was shown to you, what would be your verdict? And the thing is that in experimental economics, we try to avoid hypotheticals. We experimental economists have shown that asking someone, asking someone hypothetically, how much would you pay for this bar of soap, is different from saying, I have an actual bar of soap here and I'll sell it to you. They've shown it in different contexts too, with lotteries and choice under uncertainty, and it just seems to be a clear pattern that people will give you a different answer to your hypothetical question than they do if your question is salient, meaning that it has some kind of real world consequence. And so what I want to do is do something like these mock trials, but using the tools and the methods of experimental economics. So we find a way to make a sort of courtroom style experiment, but with real incentives. So in this case, we would take some court cases where we know the outcome, or, so we might take the evidence from a case where we know that the person was convicted, but then 5 years later there was some new piece of evidence or something, and everyone agrees that he was actually innocent. And so, take something like that, and then take another case where someone was convicted and there wasn't any, evidence that later came to exonerate them, and see if people can tell the difference. So get people to tell us what, put a weight on their belief, that the first person is guilty and that the second person is guilty, and see if people are good at telling those apart, and also hopefully see if they give different answers in the hypothetical scenario versus the one where we pay them for getting the right answer. I'm simplifying here, but by creating a scenario where there's a factual question and we have a pretty good idea of what the correct answer is, we can create a salient incentive, which is sort of our way of recreating in the lab the situation of sitting in a jury and having someone's actual life in your hands, which is, of course, a very, at least I think, a very different situation from sitting in a mock trial and having a hypothetical life in your hands. So, I had... Oh, his name escapes me, but I had a legal scholar who does work on wrongful convictions on the podcast, and it was because I was working on this project and read his name came up on some related studies, so I had him on for that reason. For anyone who was wondering, why this sort of oddball topic came up, it relates to my research.
The guest you had on that program, his name was Samuel Gross.
Yes, Sam Gross. Yeah, University of Michigan.
Yes. On your own research, I guess a nice way to end this episode would be just for you to give us a little background on how you got into economics, what interested you, what were the original questions that inspired you, maybe the original, podcast or blog posts, etc.
Okay, so I could start this at different points, right? Because when I went into, I didn't know the field of economics even existed when I graduated high school, and when I went into undergraduate program, I was originally intending to be a business student, and I just signed up for all the first year classes that the business program recommended, which of course included economics, but also sociology. And it included math courses, and I enjoyed my econ classes and my math classes so much that I decided, one thing, I started reading independently about economics. So I read Thomas Sowell, who's a very, an excellent writer on economics, writes in a very, very readable, very sort of entertaining prose about this subject that can sometimes be dry, but I don't find particularly dry. And I liked my math and econ courses so much that I switched to doing a econ major, math minor, and never looked back. So that's sort of academically how I got to now being a PhD student in economics. And the host of this podcast, because I guess I just, can't just do something as school and work. It has to be my hobby as well. If I wanted to go a little bit farther back, why was I so enamored with commerce that I wanted to be a businessman, or, wanted to study business, even though I'm probably more cut out for academic life. I'm not very social. I like math, and I like the sort of solitary, or I like the life of a researcher more than the life of a businessman, or at least as far as I can tell. But when I was in high school, I read these historical novels by a writer named James Clavell, and I believe it was his first book. It was called King Rat. It was semi-autobiographical about his time in a prisoner of war camp in Southeast Asia during World War II. He changed all the names, but he really was in that POW camp. And it was about this character called the King, who was not a king. He was an entrepreneur in this closed and sort of little microcosm of a POW camp. And and he just ran, he ran a business as best as he could. They would get, managed to trade things off of the guards of the POW camp. And then he would do things like, they discover a new technique of cooking their tobacco that just makes it, that takes this really low quality tobacco that you get in a POW camp and makes it palatable. And, it's sort of this sort of entrepreneur in this terrible setting, and it's sort of a comment on inequality as well. Cause like this guy was so rich that he had a pair of underwear, that he was the only one in this huge POW camp with underwear. And that was what made him, the equivalent of a millionaire, and everyone many people resented him for his wealth, right? But I mean, it's almost comical to us because of course he and everyone else by our standards is dirt poor. Yeah, and and just sort of the idea of the hero entrepreneur, the person who keeps himself and the people around him alive by creating value through trade, sort of appealed to me when I was a teenager. Clavel also wrote a book called Taipan. That's sort of it's about William Jardine, who was a famous a businessman in the 1830s and ran a company called Jardine Matheson that traded tea and opium out of Hong Kong, Canton and later Hong Kong. And Jardine is a complicated figure and is probably the primary reason, was the primary person lobbying the British Parliament to attack China, and, sort of an instigator of the first Opium War. So sort of a crony capitalist in a way, but that was just a fascinating book. And, obviously Clavel changed the names and some of the details, but, most of the time, if you're reading historical fiction or fantasy or all these things, it's all about, the hero with the sword using violence to save the day. And it's just, there's something wrong with humanity where we find our heroes in violence and we tend to resent and dislike merchants and people who become rich and powerful through trade and commerce. But one of these things, the violence is clearly negative sum, and the other one is positive sum. At least to the extent that you don't start wars or be an extreme cronyist. But yeah, so that's sort of where I got interested in commerce and the market and just got an interest and a positive view of the complexities and the nuances and the people who trade, who sometimes produce great prosperity and wealth through commerce and trade. And it's the whole everything that's happened from the Industrial Revolution to now, it's it's all fascinating, it's all interesting, and it's very important to understand because it's the key to why we are not all subsistence farmers like most of our ancestors.
Well, I think that should bring an end to our interview.
Yeah,
this has been fascinating look into the mind of the creator of perhaps one of Canada's top 5 or maybe top 10, definitely top 20 most popular economics podcasts.
Yeah, I'm hoping we recently crossed the 100,000 download mark. And so, if you do the math, it means the average episode gets over 2,000 downloads. And I read somewhere that about 2/3 of downloaded podcasts are listened to, so a little less than 2,000 listeners an episode, but still, that's that would fill a stadium, right?
Yeah.
and it's humbling. I worry I get a little bit of scope insensitivity, right? Where I look at them and they're just numbers, but I know there are a lot of real people out there learning about economics and listening. and I hope I haven't alienated too many of them by talking about first immigration and then climate change. We're all about science here, and so if you disagree, I promise I'll still bring on people with differing viewpoints and try to inform more than my purpose is not to create propaganda, but to inform the public. So don't stop listening. Just if I happen to disagree with you on some touchy political issues.
And with that, I think we should call that an end to the Economics Detective podcast number 50. Thanks, Garrett.
Thanks, Ash, for being the stand-in host this time. You did great.
Thank you so much.